Now, I don't want to suggest that economic calculation is unimportant. It is important, it's part of the things we ought to know. But I do want to ask about what kind of society we might have become in which it's not enough to say that something like child abuse is wrong, that we don't think that we could carry the day with the ethical argument about something like that, that instead we might only settle the argument and bring about change if there is a sufficiently strong economic argument. Economics has its place, but I don't think it should displace all other discourse, including a discourse about what is good and right, that is the discourse of ethics. It's as if we've settled for what a philosopher that I used to work with in Cambridge referred to as an enterprise association. And let me read what he had to say about this. He said, "We might imagine a city founded purely as a trading post. The laws of the city will reflect its original purpose and have to be understood in relation to this purpose. Contracts will be vigorously enforced, however unreasonable or unjust, because it is of the highest importance to retain the confidence of those with whom the city trades. Indeed, the notion of a contract being unjust will have no meaning. All education will be subordinated to the need to produce an enterprise culture, and no subject will be studied as an end in itself. The rulers of the city will regard themselves essentially as the managers of the enterprise. Their tasks will be to maximise wealth and to promote trade." Well, I wonder whether that notion is so very far away from what we often experience in terms of our own society and the dominant discourse about what it means to be in society. Is society, is the thing we belong to, simply existing to facilitate the exchange of commodities? Is everything able to be boiled down to just a question of calculation? Even this technical view, I think, is a debased view of economics. It was a much richer tradition when it was initially established by people like Adam Smith, who was a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. Yet this is the world in which we speak at the moment. Well, there is a larger context for how this might be addressed by people in the sector, and it's to take us back to things which authentically belong to this place where we live. We think about the Indigenous community. Over tens of thousands of years, it came to understand that the only way in which people can prosper on this continent is to recognise interdependence, the key issues of relationship. Even after European settlement, 40 years after European settlement, people like Alexander Harris were able to write about, in the 1830s, there's a great deal of this mutual regard, talking about this struggling to get a distinctive voice about notions of benevolence and justice in this land. For Europeans, a great deal of this mutual regard and trust engendered by two people working thus together in the otherwise solitary bush. Habits of mutual helpfulness arise, these elicit gratitude, and that leads on to regard. People under these circumstances often stand by one another through thick and thin. In fact, it is a universal feeling that a person ought to be able to trust his mate in anything. Charles Bean later on talked about a general determination, again, to stand by other people, to do what's fair, whatever the cost is to oneself. Said that it meant more to Australia than can yet be reckoned. Whatever the results, he said, and they are sometimes uncomfortable, may it long be the country's code. In other words, there was a sense, you could find it in the original inhabitants of this country, it was quickly understood by those who came here, that this is not a place just of solitary individuals hewing a future for themselves out of a bountiful nature, but rather it requires of us this kind of interdependence, this relationship upon which we rely. It requires of us a language to be able to talk about that, which goes beyond the kind of place where we are at the moment. Well, despite those three challenges, the challenges about living within a world of surfaces, about the long age of forgetting in which we might still be in the midst, and a squeezing away, if you like, of the space for the language of ethics, I think there are reasons to be optimistic because of this sector, for example. For example, we all know in this room what works. We do know that it's possible to bring about change because history shows us that that's the case. We do know that a small number of people with a powerful idea who are prepared to exercise moral courage to stand up for it can in fact effect change. We do know that the most powerful form of communication is when you speak simple truths to people, the truths that they already hold. You don't try and inject messages into their minds or spin your way, that there are deep truths about the human conditions and that we're capable of speaking them. We do know that it's not enough to counsel that people should simply be realistic, because that often takes away the impetus for action and the possibility of hope. We know that, yes, we should be pragmatic, but we should be pragmatic idealists. That it's all right to maintain our idealism and then to try and find effective means by which we achieve our ideals, but without sacrificing the essential goods which we seek to preserve. We know all of these things are possible, but they're only possible if two conditions are met. Firstly, those who would do this need to guard as best they can against the kind of hypocrisy that can sometimes undermine trust in the institutions. Not a hypocrisy born out of deliberate policy, but the kind of things that can happen because of this long age of forgetting. We need to have conversations within this sector and within the wider society about the purpose of things again. And we need to be able to challenge, and relentlessly to challenge, the occasional comfortable hold of unthinking custom and practice, where we do things because that's just what we always do, because everybody does it. That's what ethics is ultimately about. It's about the importance of an examined life. It refuses to accept that things are done simply because everybody does it. And if we do those things, if we have the courage to do so, then certain core values and principles will need to be honoured. The notion of the importance of interdependence I've mentioned, moral courage, the significance of justice and benevolence, compassion, and of course respect for persons as a core principle. And I would finally say the importance of a well-informed conscience, the ability to assess the world in which we live and to have a principled basis for how we respond to it. Now, Cassandra talked about some specific issues in terms of how one should relate in terms of the equitable treatment, not just of those who are served by those who work within this sector, but within the sector itself. And one of the things that will need to be guarded against if this sector is to play a vital role, as I think it ought, in reconditioning our language, rethinking the way that we relate to each other, is that we'll need to guard against the fact that as we do this, the community at large is cynical about professions of virtue and ideal. It's not that they don't want to believe this, they will, but what they will do is that they will do as they do with corporations or governments or almost any organisation. They will seek to understand the extent to which the commitment can be relied upon. And in order to do that, they will say, well, you tell me then, who are you? What do you stand for? And do you treat me in a manner which is consistent with that? And if you do, they will say, that's excellent, but that's not enough. Ultimately, what they will look to do is to say, and we will assess you not just in terms of how you treat us, but how do you treat everybody else who is a significant stakeholder within the world in which you operate. So, how do people in the sector treat each other? How do you treat your colleagues? How do people who operate in the same space relate to each other when in some senses they might be competing for limited resources? How does the sector respond to the siren call of government when it might offer some golden chains by which you are able to do more good work, but only at what could have been unacceptable costs in terms of the scope of your mission? What message does that send to the community which is wanting to believe that there is something substantial at the heart of the sector? How do you treat those who work with you in terms of the clients and others that you might serve? Is this evidence of mutual respect or not? What do the largest of the institutions do within the sector in relation to those that are small? Do they become mighty oak trees which blot out the sun for new initiatives that are innovative and different ways, or do they find ways to act as mentors in support of these things? These are all, I know, at one level, important issues of principle, but they're also incredibly important matters of practice. So if I can just go back to where I started, I think the notion of challenging inequality must be a consistent goal of the sector, but I think it needs to be done understanding that that challenge is going to be placed at a time and in a place when at the moment many of the odds are stacked against success because of subtle and profound changes that have taken place. And I hope that you as a sector will be an active part in the process of challenging those conditions so that when inequality is finally addressed, it's done so with lasting consequences. Thank you.